Adolf Hitler remains one of the most infamous figures in world history. His name is synonymous with totalitarianism, genocide, and war. From his early days as a struggling artist in Austria to his rise as the dictator of Nazi Germany, Hitler's life was marked by ambition, hatred, and a belief in his own destiny to reshape the world. His catastrophic decisions led to the deaths of millions and plunged Europe into the devastating conflict of World War II. This audio documentary will explore his life in 20 sections, covering key aspects of his upbringing, rise to power, and eventual downfall. Join us as we delve deep into the life of Adolf Hitler, one of history's most chilling and complex figures. Early life, birth and family. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20, 1889, in Braunau am Inn, a small Austrian town near the German border. His father, Alois Hitler, was a customs official, while his mother, Clara Pelzel, was a homemaker. Adolf was the fourth of 6 children, though many of his siblings died in infancy. This unstable family environment, combined with his father's authoritarian nature, shaped much of his early life. Alois was strict and demanding, expecting Adolf to follow in his footsteps by pursuing a career in civil service. Despite his father's wishes, young Adolf was far more interested in art and drawing. He clashed often with Alois, who disapproved of his artistic dreams. In 1903, when Hitler was just 14, Alois passed away, leaving the family with financial challenges. Clara, whom Adolf adored, became his primary emotional support, and her influence on him was profound. She died in 1907, plunging Hitler into deep grief. During his youth, Hitler's academic performance was erratic. He did well in subjects he was passionate about, but often clashed with teachers and struggled in areas that bored him. His rebellious attitude, combined with his idealistic view of the Germanic race, started to form during these early years. Vienna years, the struggling artist. Following the death of his mother, Hitler moved to Vienna in 1908, determined to pursue a career as an artist. He applied twice to the prestigious Academy of Fine Arts Vienna, but was rejected both times. This period marked the beginning of his deep personal frustration and sense of failure. Without a stable income, Hitler lived in poverty, staying in homeless shelters and flophouses. His dreams of artistic success were crushed, and he found solace in blaming others for his misfortune, particularly the Jewish community in Vienna. While in Vienna, Hitler became politically aware, immersing himself in the city's intense nationalistic and anti-Semitic atmosphere. Vienna was a melting pot of ethnic groups, and Hitler's early prejudices against Jews and Slavs began to harden during this time. Influenced by far-right political figures like Georg von Schönerer and Karl Lueger, Hitler adopted many of the extreme views that would later define his ideology. He also developed a fascination with Germanic history, believing in the superiority of the Aryan race. By 1913, Hitler had grown disillusioned with life in Vienna and moved to Munich, Germany, in the hopes of starting anew. But Munich proved no better, and Hitler continued to struggle to find his place in society. His lack of direction and financial stability made him a restless, bitter young man with deep-seated frustrations about the world around him. The outbreak of World War I, a new purpose. In 1914, World War I broke out, and for Hitler, it was a chance to find meaning in his life. He eagerly volunteered for the German army, seeing the war as an opportunity to serve a cause greater than himself and prove his worth. Hitler was assigned to the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment and served as a dispatch runner, carrying messages between command posts. He spent much of the war on the Western Front, experiencing firsthand the brutal trench warfare that characterized the conflict. Hitler's experiences during the war were formative. He proved to be a dedicated and courageous soldier, earning 2 Iron Crosses for bravery. one of which was highly unusual for a corporal. The camaraderie of military life gave Hitler a sense of belonging, something he had never experienced before. However, the war also deepened his hatred for Jews and left-wing movements, as he came to believe that Germany had been stabbed in the back by traitors on the home front, rather than defeated in battle. The end of the war in 1918 was a bitter blow for Hitler. He was hospitalized after a gas attack and, while recovering, learned of Germany's surrender. The news devastated him, and he became fixated on the idea that Germany had been betrayed from within, particularly by Jews and communists. This sense of betrayal would fuel his later political ambitions and shape his belief in the need for a radical transformation of Germany. Post-war disillusionment. Rise of nationalism. After Germany's defeat in World War I, the country was plunged into political and economic chaos. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, imposed heavy reparations on Germany and stripped it of significant territory. The Weimar Republic, which replaced the monarchy, was seen by many Germans as weak and ineffective, unable to deal with the rising poverty, unemployment, and political instability. These were the conditions that gave rise to radical political movements on both the left and right. Hitler, still a soldier, returned to Munich after the war. He was deeply resentful of the new German government and the Treaty of Versailles, viewing both as humiliations for the German people. In this environment, Hitler found his political calling. In 1919, he joined the German Workers' Party, DAP, a small nationalist group that sought to unite disillusioned veterans and promote the idea of a racially pure German state. Hitler quickly rose through the ranks, becoming the party's most charismatic speaker. During this time, Hitler developed his core beliefs, a hatred of Jews, communists, and the Weimar government, as well as a belief in the superiority of the Aryan race. He saw himself as the leader destined to restore Germany's greatness. His fiery speeches attracted a growing number of supporters, and by 1920, the DAP had transformed into the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, better known as the Nazi Party. The birth of the Nazi Party, early ideology. The Nazi Party, under Hitler's leadership, grew rapidly in the early 1920s. Hitler's powerful oratory skills, combined with his extreme nationalist and anti-Semitic rhetoric, attracted a following of disillusioned veterans, unemployed workers, and other Germans who felt betrayed by the Weimar government. The Nazi Party's ideology was rooted in the belief that the Treaty of Versailles was an unjust imposition and that Germany needed to be restored to its rightful position as a dominant power in Europe. The party's platform was built on several key ideas: the rejection of the Treaty of Versailles, the unification of all Germans into a single, racially pure state, and the removal of Jews and other minorities from positions of power. Hitler's vision was not just for political reform, but for a complete societal revolution, one that would purify Germany of what he saw as internal enemies. In 1921, Hitler became the official leader of the Nazi Party, taking the title of Führer. He surrounded himself with loyal followers, many of whom would become key figures in the Nazi regime, such as Heinrich Himmler, Hermann Göring, and Joseph Goebbels. Hitler's leadership transformed the Nazi Party into a disciplined political force, with paramilitary groups like the Sturmabteilung SA, or stormtroopers, intimidating political opponents and spreading the party's message through violence and fear. The Munich Beer Hall Putsch, a failed coup. By 1923, Hitler believed that the time was right for the Nazi Party to seize power. Inspired by Mussolini's successful March on Rome, which had led to the establishment of a fascist government in Italy, Hitler attempted to stage a coup in Munich, known as the Beer Hall Putsch. On November 8, 1923, Hitler and his followers stormed a political meeting in a Munich beer hall, hoping to rally support from the Bavarian government and local military leaders. However, the coup quickly unraveled. The Bavarian authorities, who had initially appeared supportive, withdrew their backing, and the German army remained loyal to the Weimar government. The next day, as Hitler and his supporters marched through Munich in an attempt to take control of the city, they were met by police and the putsch was violently crushed. 16 Nazis and 4 policemen were killed in the confrontation. Hitler was arrested and charged with treason. His trial, however, turned into a propaganda platform. Rather than deny the charges, Hitler used the courtroom to deliver passionate speeches about his vision for Germany's future. His performance won him national attention, and despite being sentenced to 5 years in prison, he served only 9 months. During this time, Hitler wrote his infamous manifesto, Mein Kampf, outlining his ideology and political goals. Though the putsch had failed, it marked a turning point in Hitler's rise to power, as he now saw that he would have to gain control of Germany through legal means rather than violent revolution. The road to legitimacy, rebuilding the Nazi Party. After his release from prison in December 1924, Hitler set about rebuilding the Nazi Party, which had been weakened by the failed coup. He realized that if he wanted to gain control of Germany, he needed to pursue power through the democratic system. Over the next few years, the Nazi Party rebranded itself as a legitimate political force, participating in elections and focusing on spreading its message through propaganda. During this period, Hitler concentrated on expanding the party's base of support, particularly among the middle class, rural populations, and young people. Economic hardship was rife in Germany, particularly following the hyperinflation crisis of 1923 and the global economic depression that began in 1929. The Nazi Party's promises to restore national pride, create jobs, and overturn the Treaty of Versailles resonated with many Germans who felt abandoned by the traditional political parties. Hitler also sought to consolidate his power within the party. He sidelined rivals, such as the socialist wing of the Nazi movement, and increased the role of the SA in maintaining order at Nazi rallies and intimidating opponents. By 1928, the Nazi Party was still relatively small, winning only 2.6% of the vote in the national elections. However, the economic and political chaos of the late 1920s and early 1930s would soon provide Hitler with the opportunity he had been waiting for. The Great Depression and Nazi electoral success. The Wall Street crash of 1929 sent shockwaves across the world, triggering a global economic depression. Germany was hit particularly hard. The country was already struggling to pay the reparations imposed by the Treaty of Versailles, and now unemployment skyrocketed, banks collapsed, and poverty spread rapidly. In this desperate environment, the Nazi Party's message gained traction among a wide range of disillusioned Germans. Hitler and the Nazis exploited the economic crisis by blaming the Weimar government, communists, and Jews for Germany's woes. Their propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels, used modern communication methods, including radio and mass rallies, to spread their message of national revival. Hitler promised to restore law and order, rebuild the economy, and make Germany a powerful nation once again. Many Germans, weary of the seemingly endless political and economic instability, found these promises appealing. In the 1930 elections, the Nazi Party made significant gains, becoming the second largest party in the Reichstag with 107 seats. By 1932, the Nazis were the largest party, though they still did not have an outright majority. Despite this, Hitler's growing popularity made him a powerful figure in German politics, and it became clear that he was positioning himself for the ultimate goal, the chancellorship. Hitler becomes chancellor, the path to dictatorship. The political deadlock in Germany in the early 1930s set the stage for Hitler's rise to power. The Weimar Republic was struggling to govern effectively, with frequent changes in government and growing polarization between the left and right. In January 1933, after a series of backroom deals and political maneuvering, President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. Many conservative politicians believed they could control Hitler and use his popularity to stabilize the country, but they underestimated his ambitions. Once in power, Hitler wasted no time in consolidating his position. The Reichstag fire in February 1933 provided him with the perfect pretext to crack down on political opposition, particularly the communists. The Reichstag fire decree, passed shortly after the fire, suspended civil liberties and allowed for the arrest of political opponents without due process. The Enabling Act, passed in March 1933, gave Hitler the power to rule by decree, effectively dismantling the Weimar Constitution and giving him dictatorial powers. With the legal framework in place, Hitler began to eliminate his rivals, both within the Nazi Party and in the broader political sphere. In the summer of 1934, during the Night of the Long Knives, he ordered the assassination of SA leaders, including Ernst Röhm, who he viewed as a potential threat. This purge not only secured Hitler's control over the Nazi Party, but also won him the loyalty of the German military, which had viewed the SA with suspicion. By the time President Hindenburg died in August 1934, Hitler had already merged the positions of Chancellor and President, declaring himself Führer of Germany. The Nazi police state, control and propaganda. Once Hitler had established himself as the absolute ruler of Germany, he set about transforming the country into a totalitarian state. The Nazi regime used a combination of terror, propaganda, and political repression to maintain control over the German population. Key to this system was the Gestapo, the secret police, and the SS, an elite paramilitary organization led by Heinrich Himmler. Both played a central role in rooting out political dissent, persecuting Jews and other minorities, and enforcing Nazi ideology. The Nazis also used propaganda to shape public opinion and create a cult of personality around Hitler. Joseph Goebbels, as Minister of Propaganda, orchestrated a massive campaign that included posters, films, and mass rallies designed to glorify Hitler and the Nazi Party. The message was clear. Hitler was the savior of Germany, and under his leadership, the country would regain its rightful place in the world. The Nazis also controlled the press, censoring any criticism of the regime and ensuring that only pro-Nazi voices were heard. The educational system was also co-opted to indoctrinate young Germans with Nazi ideology. Textbooks were rewritten to reflect racist and nationalist views, and children were encouraged to join Nazi youth organizations like the Hitler Youth. This comprehensive system of control, combined with the regime's use of terror, ensured that by the mid-1930s, opposition to Hitler's rule was minimal. The Nazi racial state, anti-Semitism, and Aryan supremacy. One of the core tenets of Hitler's ideology was the belief in the superiority of the Aryan race and the need to purify Germany of undesirable elements, particularly Jews. From the beginning of his political career, Hitler had espoused vicious anti-Semitism, blaming Jews for Germany's defeat in World War I and the economic hardships that followed. Once in power, the Nazi regime systematically implemented policies aimed at marginalizing and ultimately eliminating the Jewish population from German society. The Nuremberg Laws, passed in 1935, were a key part of this racial agenda. These laws stripped Jews of their German citizenship, prohibited marriage and sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews, and codified the racial hierarchy that placed Aryans at the top and Jews, along with other minority groups, at the bottom. Jews were gradually excluded from public life, losing their jobs, businesses, and rights. The Nazis also targeted other groups they considered racially or socially inferior, including Romani people, disabled individuals, and homosexuals. These groups were subjected to sterilization, euthanasia, and other forms of persecution as part of the regime's broader effort to cleanse German society. This racial policy would later escalate into the horrors of the Holocaust, where millions of Jews and other minorities were systematically murdered. Hitler's foreign policy, expansion and aggression. From the moment Hitler came to power, he sought to overturn the Treaty of Versailles and expand Germany's borders. His foreign policy was driven by the concept of Lebensraum, living space, which held that the German people needed more territory to sustain their growing population. This expansionist vision, combined with Hitler's desire to create a racially pure empire, led to a series of aggressive moves that would eventually plunge Europe into World War II. In 1936, Hitler began rearming Germany, violating the Treaty of Versailles, which had limited the size of the German military. He also remilitarized the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone between Germany and France, further defying the treaty. These moves were met with little resistance from the Western powers, emboldening Hitler to pursue even more aggressive actions. Hitler's next target was Austria. In 1938, he orchestrated the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria into Nazi Germany. The annexation was welcomed by many Austrians who shared Hitler's vision of a united German-speaking nation. Shortly after, Hitler set his sights on Czechoslovakia, specifically the Sudetenland, a region with a significant ethnic German population. Through a combination of diplomatic pressure and threats of military force, Hitler convinced Britain and France to allow Germany to annex the Sudetenland in the Munich Agreement of 1938. These early victories, without significant opposition from the Allies, further convinced Hitler that he could achieve his goals through a combination of intimidation and military might. The road to war, the invasion of Poland. By 1939, Hitler's ambitions had grown even bolder. He had successfully annexed Austria and the Sudetenland without provoking a major conflict. But his next move would have far more serious consequences. In the summer of 1939, Hitler turned his attention to Poland. He sought to reclaim the territory lost to Poland after World War I and expand Germany's influence in Eastern Europe. To avoid a two-front war, Hitler struck a surprising deal with the Soviet Union. The Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, signed in August 1939, ensured that Germany and the Soviet Union would not attack each other and secretly divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. With the Eastern Front secured, Hitler ordered the invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939. This act of aggression finally triggered a response from Britain and France, who declared war on Germany 2 days later. World War II had begun. The invasion of Poland was swift and brutal, with the German military employing a new tactic known as blitzkrieg, or lightning war, which involved rapid, coordinated attacks by tanks, aircraft, and infantry. Within weeks, Poland had been conquered, and its territory was divided between Germany and the Soviet Union. The fall of Poland marked the beginning of Hitler's larger campaign to conquer Europe, and it set the stage for the global conflict that would follow. Early victories, conquering Europe. In the early years of World War II, Hitler's military strategies led to a series of stunning victories for Nazi Germany. After the swift defeat of Poland, Hitler turned his attention to Western Europe. In the spring of 1940, German forces launched a surprise invasion of Denmark and Norway, securing valuable resources and strategic positions. Shortly after, in May 1940, Hitler unleashed his forces on Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. The invasion of France was particularly significant. Using the blitzkrieg tactic once again, German forces bypassed the heavily fortified Maginot Line by advancing through the Ardennes forest, a move that caught the French and their British allies off guard. Within weeks, Paris fell, and France surrendered in June 1940. Hitler celebrated this victory by forcing the French to sign the armistice in the same railway carriage where Germany had signed its surrender in 1918, a symbolic act of revenge. With France defeated, Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. Hitler hoped to force Britain into a peace settlement, but when Prime Minister Winston Churchill refused to negotiate, Hitler planned an invasion of the British Isles, known as Operation Sea Lion. However, the German Luftwaffe failed to gain air superiority during the Battle of Britain, and the invasion was ultimately called off. Despite this setback, Hitler's early conquests had expanded the Nazi Empire across much of Europe, and by 1941, he controlled vast territories stretching from France to Poland. Turning east, the invasion of the Soviet Union. With much of Western Europe under Nazi control, Hitler's attention turned to the Soviet Union. He had always seen communism and the Soviet regime as mortal enemies of the Nazi state, and the vast lands of the Soviet Union represented the Lebensraum he sought for Germany. In June 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in military history, with over 3 million German troops attacking the Soviet Union along a 1,800-mile front. At first, the invasion was incredibly successful. The German army advanced rapidly, capturing vast swaths of Soviet territory and encircling entire Soviet armies. By the fall of 1941, German forces were closing in on Moscow, and it seemed that the Soviet Union might collapse under the weight of the assault. However, the tide began to turn as the harsh Russian winter set in, and Soviet resistance stiffened. Hitler, who had expected a quick victory, refused to allow his armies to retreat, leading to disastrous losses. The Battle of Moscow in the winter of 1941-1942 marked the first major setback for Nazi Germany in the war. Despite their initial successes, German forces were unable to capture the Soviet capital, and the Soviet counteroffensive pushed them back. The invasion of the Soviet Union would eventually prove to be a fatal mistake for Hitler, as the long, brutal conflict on the Eastern Front drained Germany's resources and manpower. The Holocaust, genocide on an unprecedented scale. While the war raged across Europe, Hitler's regime was carrying out one of the most horrific atrocities in human history: the Holocaust. From the beginning of his political career, Hitler had blamed Jews for Germany's problems and advocated for their removal from society. With the start of World War II, Nazi anti-Semitic policies escalated into a campaign of systematic extermination. In 1941, the Nazis began implementing the final solution, a plan to eradicate the Jewish population of Europe. Jews were rounded up and deported to concentration and extermination camps, where they were subjected to forced labor, starvation, and mass murder. The most infamous of these camps was Auschwitz, where over 1 million people, mostly Jews, were killed in gas chambers or died from other causes. The Holocaust claimed the lives of 6 million Jews, as well as millions of others, including Romani people, disabled individuals, political dissidents, and prisoners of war. The scale and brutality of the genocide were unprecedented, and the Nazis used industrial methods to carry out the mass murder. Hitler viewed the extermination of the Jews as a central part of his vision for a racially pure empire, and he remained committed to this goal even as the war began to turn against him. The turning tide, defeats in North Africa and Stalingrad. By 1942, the tide of the war was beginning to turn against Nazi Germany. In North Africa, German forces under General Erwin Rommel, known as the Desert Fox, had initially been successful in pushing back the British. However, the Allies, led by Britain and the United States, launched a counteroffensive that culminated in the Battle of El Alamein in October 1942. Rommel's forces were defeated, and the Allies soon began pushing the Axis powers out of North Africa. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the German advance had stalled. Hitler's obsession with capturing Stalingrad, a major industrial city on the Volga River, led to one of the deadliest battles in history. The Battle of Stalingrad, which lasted from August 1942 to February 1943, saw brutal urban warfare as German and Soviet forces fought for control of the city. Despite initial successes, the Germans were encircled by Soviet forces, and Hitler refused to allow a retreat. The German Sixth Army, trapped in Stalingrad, eventually surrendered in February 1943. The defeat at Stalingrad was a turning point in the war, marking the beginning of a steady decline in Nazi fortunes. From this point on, the Soviet Union would push the Germans back toward Berlin, while the Western Allies prepared to launch their own offensive in Europe. The Allies' advance, D-Day, and the liberation of Europe. As the war dragged on, the Allies began preparing for a massive invasion of German-occupied Europe. On June 6, 1944, the Allies launched Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in history, landing on the beaches of Normandy, France. D-Day, as it became known, was a critical moment in the war, as Allied forces, led by the United States, Britain, and Canada, began the liberation of Western Europe. The Normandy invasion was followed by a series of victories as Allied forces pushed the Germans back across France and into Belgium. In August 1944, Paris was liberated, and by the fall of that year, the Allies were advancing toward Germany itself. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union continued its relentless push from the east, capturing territory in Eastern Europe and moving ever closer to Berlin. Hitler's once dominant empire was now crumbling. The German military was stretched thin, fighting on multiple fronts and facing a growing resistance movement within occupied territories. Despite the worsening situation, Hitler refused to consider surrender, ordering his forces to fight to the last man. His delusions of victory, combined with the brutal repression of any dissent within Germany, ensured that the war would continue until the bitter end. Hitler's last stand, the fall of Berlin. By early 1945, it was clear that the war was lost for Nazi Germany. The Allies had crossed the Rhine River and were advancing into the heart of Germany from the west, while the Soviets were closing in from the east. Hitler, who had retreated to his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, remained defiant, ordering counteroffensives that had little chance of success. The final months of the war saw some of the most intense and desperate fighting as German forces, many of them made up of teenage boys and old men, tried to defend their crumbling regime. In April 1945, the Soviet army launched its assault on Berlin, encircling the city and beginning a brutal street-by-street battle to capture the Nazi capital. Hitler, now increasingly isolated and paranoid, continued to issue irrational orders, refusing to leave the city, even as it became clear that defeat was imminent. On April 30, 1945, as Soviet troops closed in on the Reich Chancellery, Hitler took his own life, along with his new wife Eva Braun, in the bunker. His death marked the effective end of the Third Reich. A week later, on May 7, 1945, Germany officially surrendered to the Allies, bringing an end to the war in Europe. Hitler's grand vision of a 1,000-year Reich had lasted just 12 years, and his reign had left Europe in ruins. The legacy of Hitler, destruction and consequences. Adolf Hitler's rise and fall left a profound and lasting impact on the world. His regime had caused unimaginable suffering, leading to the deaths of tens of millions of people, including 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. The destruction wrought by World War II reshaped the global order, leading to the division of Europe, the rise of the United States and the Soviet Union as superpowers, and the beginning of the Cold War. Hitler's legacy is one of unparalleled evil. His ideas of racial purity and Aryan supremacy, combined with his lust for power, led to some of the darkest chapters in human history. The lessons of his dictatorship have been studied and analyzed by historians, political scientists, and psychologists, all seeking to understand how a man with such extreme views could come to power and cause such devastation. In the post-war world, the Nuremberg trials held many of Hitler's top officials accountable for war crimes, though many others escaped justice. The horrors of the Nazi regime also led to a renewed focus on human rights, resulting in the creation of international institutions like the United Nations and a commitment to preventing future genocides. Hitler's rise to power serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked totalitarianism, extremism, and hate. Thank you for listening to this comprehensive documentary on Adolf Hitler, from his early life to his downfall. If you found this content insightful, please consider subscribing to our channel for more in-depth historical documentaries. Be sure to check out our other videos on World War II and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed.